Shalom Aleichem, dear viewers of Hagyana-Atouraya. It's an honor for us to present today Dr. Nicholas Algilu in this short lecture about the Assyrian genocide titled A Case of the Assyrian Genocide. Dr. Nicholas Algilu is currently a lecturer at the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies, University of Melbourne, specializing in Syriac studies. He is additionally affiliated with the Syriac Language Research Center at the University of Divinity. In 2013, he finished his doctoral dissertation at the University of Sydney, focusing on the socio-cultural history and heritage of ethnic Assyrians in Iran. He also has a Master of Arts in World Religions, Eastern Christianity from Leiden University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Semitic Languages. Dr. Algilu has co-authored a modern Aramaic phrasebook and dictionary, Hippocrane Books 2007, published this year. And his most recent publications include a chapter on Iraq's ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in the upcoming volume. The Legacy of Iran, the Legacy of Iraq, Intervention, Occupation, and Withdrawal, Edinburgh University Press 2015. Nicholas Algilu is a socio-cultural historian with expertise in indigenous Middle Eastern minorities, Eastern Christianity, the history of the Middle East and Islamic world, as well as interfaith and intercultural relations. As a scholar in the field of Middle Eastern, Syriac, and modern Assyrian studies, he has been active in research and field work for the past 15 years. I'll leave you now with Nicholas Algilu in the lecture titled A Case of the Assyrian Genocide. Please.
Thank you. Just before I begin, I'd like to thank the website Hagyana-Atouraya, the Assyrian Analyzer, for having me with them to present this brief lecture about the Assyrian Genocide. The title is The Assyrian Case for Genocide, A Brief Overview. I tried to keep it as brief as possible. So, here you can see, obviously, the map of what we would call Assyrian lands, just to set the scene in the beginning. So, the area that we're talking about is this area that joins the four countries of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Obviously, before World War I, there was no border between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. They were all part of the same country. And here you have Urmi with Lake Urmia, Hakkari, Van around Lake Van, Tur Abdin, the Nineveh Plains, etc. So the question I'll be answering today is, does the orgy of death and destruction that engulfed Anatolia and Mesopotamia between 1914 and 1925, affecting the indigenous Assyrians, constitute a case of genocide? Indeed, scholars consider those events to be part of the same policy of extermination as that of the Armenians, which is acknowledged to have been one of the first modern genocides and a precursor to the Holocaust. Just to show or to illustrate the link between the Armenian or the Assyrian genocide and the Holocaust, Konstantin Freiherr von Neurath, who was attached to the Turkish Fourth Army in 1915 with instructions to monitor operations against the Armenians, later became Hitler's foreign minister and protector of Bohemia and Moravia during the time when the Jews of Czechoslovakia were being deported. So, just a little rundown of the Assyrian genocide. The Assyrian genocide was a premeditated and systematic campaign of extermination characterized by forced relocation and massacre of ethnic Assyrians. And by Assyrians, I'm also meaning people that call themselves Chaldeans, Syriacs, or Arameans, within the Ottoman and Persian empires between 1914 and 1925, and some say even later. Some say it's continued even until today. And this was carried out largely by the Ottoman Empire and later on by the Army of the Republic of Turkey. together with other armed and allied Muslim peoples, including Kurds, Chechens, and Circassians, with further attacks on unarmed and fleeing civilians conducted by local Arab and Persian militias. Furthermore, it occurred simultaneously with the genocides perpetrated against other indigenous Christian populations, such as the Armenians and the Greeks. On the eve of the First World War, the Assyrian population numbered about 1 million and was largely concentrated in what are now Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. It is estimated that between August 1914 and September 1925, the Assyrians lost over 2/3 of their population to acts of genocide, roughly 750,000 people. This also resulted in the emptying out of entire regions that had previously been populated in the majority by indigenous Assyrians, and the erasure of much of their material, culture, and tangible heritage. So here you can see a map of the Ottoman Empire, well, a map of the Middle East around the time of the genocide. You have the Ottoman Empire here, the Russian Empire and the Persian empires, and areas where the Assyrians lived. So you have Hakkari, so Sirt, Botan, Diyarbakir, including Tur Abdin, Mosul and the villages of the Nineveh Plain, Urmia, of course, and Urfa, Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, etc. So this generally was the Assyrian homeland. It was where the Assyrians lived in the majority before the First World War. Now, Henry Morgenthau, the United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from 1913 to 1916, accused the Turkish government of a campaign of outrageous terrorizing, cruel torturing, driving of women into harems, debauchery of innocent girls, the sale of many of them at 80 cents each, the murdering of hundreds of thousands, and the deportation to and starvation in the desert of other hundreds of thousands, and the destruction of hundreds of villages and many cities. And all of this were part of the willful execution of a scheme to annihilate the Armenian, Greek, and Syrian, or Assyrian, Christians of Turkey. It sounds very similar, scary, but similar to some things that are happening today. Now, in the space of one decade, the Christian population of the regions that now constitute the Republic of Turkey went from some 5 million, accounting for between a quarter and a third of the Ottoman Empire's total population, to less than 700,000. This figure has since fallen to little more than 115,000 today, forming 0.15% of the country's total population, and among them there are roughly 20 to 25,000 Assyrians. Turkey, the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, today denies the word genocide as an accurate term for these mass killings that began to be perpetrated under Ottoman rule. I hope that by the end of my presentation, you will have formed an opinion based on evidence rather than emotion. So I will start with the question, what is genocide? The standard legal definition and parameters of systematic and premeditated exterminations of peoples, or genocide, is that included in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. This document was drafted by Raphael Lemkin, who you see pictured here, who was a Polish Jewish lawyer in 1945 at the request of the newly formed United Nations organization. Lemkin was explicitly moved both by the annihilation of Christian Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians in Anatolia, as well as by the Semele massacre in 1933, to first coin the word genocide in 1943. The convention was adopted by the UN's General Assembly as Resolution 96 on December 11th, 1946. Article 1 reads as follows. The contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Article 2 gives the definition of genocide. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So just to go over that again, any of the following acts with intent to destroy, whether it's in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So what were these acts? The first act is killing members of the group. The second is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Third, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, again in whole or in part. Fourth, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And fifth, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, the key words in this definition of what constitutes genocide are any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part. How then does genocide occur? How does one group of people arrive at the decision to murder another group of people en masse? Scholars of the Jewish Holocaust have developed a theoretical framework for beginning to answer this question. Professor Colin Tatz, who you see pictured here, founder of the Centre of Genocide Studies at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, named this framework the 4 building blocks of genocide. Firstly, there must exist an ancient hatred between the perpetrators and the victims. Secondly, there must exist the means and opportunity to execute the plan, usually but not always under the cover of a war situation. Thirdly, the organizational and technological capacity to execute the plan. And fourthly, the actual killings themselves. So let's start with the first building block, ancient hatred. Violence directed against Assyrians prior to this was not new. As Christians in a predominantly Muslim or Islamic society, they were perceived by their overlords as kuffar or gavurlar, a pejorative meaning infidels or unbelievers. They were even generalized as Ermeniler or Ermeni peace, dirty Armenians, with the same meaning as gavurlar or kuffar. In the Ottoman Empire, in accordance with the Islamic dhimmi system, all Christians were accorded certain limited freedoms, such as the right to worship, but were in essence treated as second-class citizens. So Christians were not considered as equal to Muslims. Okay, in addition to other legal limitations, the testimony against Muslims by Christians and Jews was inadmissible, and it was not equal. Christians or Jews were forbidden to carry weapons or ride atop horses. Their houses could not overlook those of Muslims, and their religious practices were severely circumscribed. Violation of any of these statutes could result in fines or execution. Assyrians in particular were subject to the whims of their Turkish and Kurdish neighbors, who would regularly overtax them, subject them to brigandage, kidnapping, and outright massacre, force them to convert to Islam, and otherwise exploit them without interference from central or local authorities. This was the case during massacres conducted by Kurdish Emir Badr Khan Bek of Botan in the 1840s, in which up to 50,000 Assyrians from Hakkari to Tur Abdin lost their lives. Here you see a general map of the Ottoman Empire to give you an idea of where, for example, Nisibis, Mosul, Diyarbakir, Mesopotamia, where these places were in relation to the rest of the empire. Obviously, the situation or the relations, I should say, between Assyrians and Kurds, or Assyrians and Turks, or Assyrians and other Muslims was not always so bad, especially on a personal level, but we can't deny that there were many times or many societies which took advantage of the lower status of Christians within their society. So now I'm going to move on to Abdul Hamid II, the Red Sultan, so called because of his active participation or active planning in the murder of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In 1890, Sultan Abdul Hamid II created a paramilitary outfit known as the Hamidiyye, which was made up of Kurdish irregulars who were tasked to deal with the Armenians as they wished. In October 1895, massacres of Armenians broke out in Constantinople and then engulfed the rest of the Armenian and Assyrian populated provinces of Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Erzurum, Kharput, Sivas, Trabzon, Aleppo, and Van. Estimates on how many Armenians were killed in the violence, which later became known as the Hamidian massacres, placed the figures at 300,000, while another 100,000 Assyrians are estimated to have perished. Although Abdul Hamid was never directly implicated in ordering the massacres, it is believed that they had his tacit approval, because no one was ever caught afterwards. In April 1909, another 30,000 Armenians and up to 3,000 Assyrians were massacred in the town of Adana. This was accompanied by the pillaging of Christian enclaves in the surrounding area by Ottoman troops. Which brings me to the plan. And here you see a map of Turan, which was supposed to be a Turkic state stretching all the way from the Adriatic or from Constantinople to the shores of the Pacific through Siberia and Mongolia. Now, for a case of mass murder to be genocide, the intent to exterminate an entire group of people must exist. The Young Turks came to power in the Ottoman Empire in a coup d'etat on the 24th of July 1908, which effectively deposed Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Once they seized power, they then proceeded to systematically replace the old Ottoman bureaucrats with young Muslims fired with the passion to create Turan, a Turkic state stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Great Wall of China and encompassing all Turkish-speaking and Turkic-related peoples, including the Mongolians. At the annual Congress of the Young Turks Ittihad wa Taraqi Jamiyati, or Committee for Union and Progress, also known as CUP, in Thessaloniki in late September, early October 1910, the Congress's president remarked that no reliance could be placed upon Christians, and as Europe always regarded the affairs of Turkey through Christian spectacles, every effort must be made to crush the propaganda of the empire's Christian nationalities, which might attract the attention of European politicians. Muslims generally should retain their arms, and where they are in a minority, arms should be distributed to them by the authorities. Immigration of Muslims from the Caucasus and Turkestan must be encouraged, land provided for the immigrants, and the Christians prevented from purchasing property. Turkey was essentially a Muslim country, and Muslim ideas and influence must preponderate. No reliance could be placed on Christians, who were always working for the downfall of the new regime. Sooner or later, the complete Ottomanization of all Turkish subjects must be effected, but it was becoming clear that this could never be achieved by persuasion, and recourse must be had to the force of arms. Of course, at the following year's Congress, again held in Thessaloniki, it was chaired by Talat Pasha, Minister of the Interior in the Young Turk government, and one of their chief ideologues, who you see pictured here, Dr. Bahauddin Shakir. Dr. Shakir told the assembly that the nations that remain from the old times in our empire are akin to foreign and harmful weeds that must be uprooted to clear our land. The use of biological terms like harmful weeds and bacillus, which is how the Nazis referred to the Jews, is common in hate literature and hate speech. In order to kill on the scale we are talking about, a degree of dehumanization is required. The victims must cease being human. They must stop being people in the minds of the perpetrators, so that the majority of the population will accept their leaders' plans for mass murder. So, the indigenous Christian peoples of Anatolia, including the Assyrians, became foreign and harmful weeds that must be uprooted from their own homelands. By 1914, the extreme wing of the CUP was in complete control of the Ottoman bureaucracy and military. Now, genocide is only possible when extensive resources are devoted to the destruction of the victim group, in our case, the indigenous Assyrians. The entire Ottoman state was thus utilized in the undeclared war of the Young Turks against them. Talat Pasha, Minister of the Interior, and Anvar Pasha, Minister of War, both worked to set up the Teshkilati Makhsusa, or Special Organization, in 1913. Just to give you an idea, the deputy head of the Special Organization was Jalal Bayar, the provincial responsible secretary of the committee, who later became the President of the Republic of Turkey. So now that you know where people from this special organization ended up, let me tell you a little bit about this organization. It functioned like a special forces outfit, and its purpose was to gather, organize, and coordinate the foot soldiers of the genocide. Bands of muhajirs, Muslim refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasus, who had a desire to take revenge upon Christians because they had been mistreated by Christians where they had come from. Thousands of violent criminals released from prisons, especially for this purpose, and Kurdish tribesmen lured by the promise of loot, women, and land grabs. This disparate group constituted the infamous Cheta, or bandits, who were charged to escort the convoys of deportees. Wahib Pasha, commander of the Ottoman Third Army, called these members of this special organization the butchers of the human species. So, one of their leaders later became president of Turkey. So now I'm going to move on to the opportunity. Now, the opportunity to execute this plan came, of course, in the form of World War I, which began in late July 1914. On August the 1st, the Ottoman Empire signed a secret alliance treaty with Germany, which declared war on Russia that same day. On November the 1st, the Ottoman Empire officially entered the First World War, with Russia's declaration of war against them, and at the same time declared a holy war, or jihad, against the Christian powers it was fighting. And here you can see a picture of the declaration of jihad. Even before the war had begun, however, the Ottoman government was planning and ordering the uprooting and destruction of its Christian population. In the summer of 1914, the special organization, assisted by government and army officials, conscripted Christian men of military age into labor battalions, in which thousands died. These conscripts were sent hundreds of miles into the interior of Anatolia, where they were employed in road making, building, tunnel excavating, and other field work, but their numbers were heavily reduced through either privations and ill treatment or by outright massacre by the Ottoman guards and officers. This policy of persecution and ethnic cleansing eliminated all men of fighting age. So if you get rid of all the men that can fight, you can't have resistance to the implementation of your genocidal plan. On August the 3rd, Tahsin Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Van, arranged a meeting between him and the Assyrian Church of the East Patriarch, Mar Binyamin Shimon, where a number of promises were made to keep the Assyrians of that province neutral and loyal to the Ottoman state. In exchange for the establishment of schools, roads, and infrastructure in their areas, the church's prelates were entrusted with the collection of aid for the Ottoman military's mobilization, or Seferberlik. This included the provision of sheep and mules, as well as shoes and socks for the soldiers. The authorities were also confiscating wheat from the Assyrians for this purpose, and at the same time, soldiers were being conscripted from amongst the Assyrians around Van. None of them were ever seen or heard from again. And also, Their homes were being plundered by the army in the name of collecting aid. From that month onwards, the Assyrians in the district of Norcia, bordering Iran, were beginning to flee from violent attacks by the Ottoman military. At the same time, practically all the Assyrians of the villages of Marbishu, Iyel, and the Shamsdinan district had fled to the Urmia plain in Iran, and the Ottoman military had been reported to be arming Kurdish tribesmen, while at the same time confiscating weapons from any Assyrians that they were able to. As the survivors attempted to flee their attackers, many of them were captured and brutally slain. Wholesale massacres of Assyrian villages by Ottoman troops were also being reported in the districts of Gawar and Albaq. This all occurred prior to the Ottoman Empire's official participation in the First World War, with Russia's declaration of war against them on November 1st. So here you can see a map of the area. Here you have Van, which is where the meeting was held on the 3rd of August. Here is the border between the Persian and Ottoman empires. Kochanis is the village where the Assyrian patriarch Mar Binyamin Shimun was residing, and the districts of Albaq, Gawar, as well as Norcia, Marbishu, and Iyel on the borders here. So these are the areas that we were just talking about. Exactly as the world saw during the 1940s, in the middle of a world war, the Ottoman Empire devoted enormous resources to the massacre of nearly half of the population of Asia Minor, Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. At one stage, the empire was fighting on no less than 4 separate battlefronts: the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Caucasus Mountains, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Palestine. Every available man, weapon, automobile, and rail car was required for the war effort. Yet, we have Australian prisoners of war reporting trainloads of Armenian deportees coming from Northeast Asia Minor to the Taurus Mountains. Soldiers needed to fight at the fronts were instead sent to escort columns of deportees on death marches hundreds of kilometers in length, and sent to northern Mesopotamia to burn Assyrian villages and kill every Assyrian they could lay their hands on. After the initial massacre of Assyrians in Van and the border regions, the Ottoman policy of destruction extended into the neighboring Persian Empire, or modern-day Iran. On the 24th of December 1914, Ottoman War Minister Anvar Pasha implemented a plan to encircle and destroy the Russian army at Sarikamish in order to regain territories formerly lost to Russia around the city of Kars. Anvar's forces were routed in the battle and almost completely destroyed, with the blame laid on Armenians who were fighting for the Russians. As a result, many of the retreating troops under Javdad Bey embarked on a military incursion at the beginning of 1915 into the Assyrian districts of Urmia and Salamas in Iranian Azerbaijan. Due to the period of weak central government and Tehran's inability to protect its territorial integrity, no resistance was offered by the Persian troops when the Turks invaded after the withdrawal of Russians from the area. Now, as we know, these Turkish soldiers returning from Sarikamish took their revenge on the innocent Assyrians and Armenians of that area. Unarmed Assyrians were massacred, died of hunger or disease. Thousands of girls as young as 7 had been raped or forcibly converted to Islam, and 200 Christian villages were destroyed, with 3/4 of them burned to the ground. Many women and girls were abducted, raped, and forced into harems against their will. This campaign was only ended with the return of the Russians in May of that year, 1915. Similarly, the city of Edessa, or Urfa, in Mesopotamia, did not lie anywhere near any of the battlefronts. In January 1915, 2 German officers commanded units of the Ottoman Empire, including heavy artillery, in attacking and destroying this ancient center, massacring many of its Assyrian and Armenian inhabitants. So here you see a picture of old Edessa or Urfa. Here is the large Armenian cathedral of St. John, which today is the Salah ad-Din Ayyubi Mosque. Here you see a photograph of some Catholic schoolgirls in Edessa. And here is a picture of some of the Armenians that tried to defend themselves from the attack on their part of the city by the Turks and Kurds in July of 1915. And the last photograph here is a collection of some of their skulls. Now, I mentioned Cevdet Bey, who was in charge of the Ottoman army when it invaded Urmia and Salamas and committed the atrocities I just spoke about. Cevdet is reported to have held a meeting in February 1915 at which he said, "We have cleansed the Armenians and Syrians from Azerbaijan, and we will do the same in Van." Now, I think this was around the time that Cevdet became the Governor General of Van. So this must have been his promise to his constituents. You know, I've destroyed the Armenians and the Syrians across the border, and I'm going to do the same here. On the 29th of May 1915, the CUP Central Committee passed the temporary law of deportation, or the Tahjir law, giving the Ottoman government and military authorization to deport anyone it sensed as a threat to national security. With the implementation of this law, the confiscation of Christian property and the widespread slaughter ensued. Armed resistance to forced conscription and deportation was subsequently labeled as revolts by the government. The killings and mass starvation were thus systematic, authorized, and organized by the government through the legal system. From the statements of Talat Pasha and some of what is written in his journal, it is clear that the officials were aware of the deportation order and that it was genocidal. Here you can see a map of the Armenian genocide, just to give you an idea of how organized the deportation structure was, especially in the Armenian case. Maybe not so the Assyrian one. Now, in mid-1915, Cevdet Bey entered the towns of Bitlis and Siirt with 8,000 soldiers, who he himself called the Butcher's Battalion, Qassab Taburu. And he ordered the massacre of Armenians and almost 20,000 Assyrian civilians living in those cities, as well as the surrounding villages. The Assyrians had at least 30 villages around Siirt. The eyewitness accounts from Siirt describe the systematic process used by the authorities. First, the community's secular and religious leaders, as well as intellectuals and the wealthy, were imprisoned and tortured to death. Among them was the renowned Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of that town, Mar ad-Deysher, who was well respected in European circles as a keen scholar and an intelligent man. This was followed by the arrest of all able-bodied men who were taken some distance from the city at a place called the Ziryab Valley, where they were tied together and shot. And this was a common method of killing. It was even used in Urmia before. This was followed by the rounding up of the male children and teenagers who were taken to a nearby cliff and thrown into the river valley below. So, just to show you, these are some old black and white photographs of Siirt. And this picture here in the corner is the only remaining relic of Sirt's Christian community. It is the well of Ain Salib, or the well of the cross, the spring of the cross, and it was at the center of the Chaldean Catholic quarter or neighborhood of the city. It's still there today, but it's all that's left. And this is the cliff of Ras al-Hajar, from where boys between the ages of 4 and 14 were thrown by the authorities. It's still called Ras al-Hajar today, it's still there. Finally, the women, girls and elderly were then gathered up and deported, only to be attacked by Kurdish tribespeople who robbed and murdered them and took the prettiest ones into their harems. Now this occurred in a valley called Wadi Wawayla, which was between Sirt and Mardin, somewhere between Sirt and Mardin. The people that were being deported thought that they were being deported to Mardin. This technique was often used also in the Assyrian villages and towns around Diyarbakir and Mardin. Other villages, however, were massacred outright, so there was no systematic process involved. German ambassador Hans Freiherr von Wangenheim, who you see pictured here, reported that the Ottoman Empire was being cleared of its indigenous Christians by elimination. In July 1915, he confirmed that the Assyrians of Midyat, Nisibis, and Jazira were also slain. So here you can see Midyat, Nisibis, and Jazira, the three main towns of the Turabdin region. And here is Mardin and here is Sirt, to give you an idea of the geography. Assyrian survivors from many of the villages in Turabdin that were attacked flocked to centers such as Ain Wardo, Bissorino, Azakh, and Benabil, where they put up fierce resistance to attacks by Ottoman troops. And here you see pictures of this is the cave monastery, for example, in Benabil, where the Assyrians of Benabil defended themselves and fought against attacks from the Ottoman troops who were trying to exterminate them. Here you can see a picture of the village of Bissorino, and to the side you see the famous image of the Virgin Mary of Azakh, Adrat Azakh, who is said to have appeared to guard that village as the people there were trying to fight and put up resistance against those that were trying to exterminate them. There is even a story that the church itself was firing bullets at the attackers. Obviously, the most famous of them all, in Iwardo, the siege lasted over 3 months in the heat of summer, but the troops eventually gave up and left. The Assyrians of Turabdin still refer to 1915 as the year of Sayfor, or the year of the sword. Of course, Sayfor has many meanings in Syriac. It doesn't just mean the sword. Sayfor can also mean a massacre. It should be noted, though, that whilst this name has become one that is commonly used to denote the Assyrian genocide, it is not one used by Eastern Assyrians at all. Rather, through my fieldwork research in Urmia for my PhD thesis, I found that as early as January to May 1915, 3 inscriptions from the village of Gulpashan indicate that the year was commonly known as the year of the plundering and slaughter of the Suriaye, the year of the slaughter, or year of captivity. So here you can see Pshitat al-Puchmu Khamshassar in the year 1915, Shita Itslaba Uqatla Suriaye. And then you have Pshitat Yakhsiruta, 1915, the year of captivity, or also Shitat Qatla. As mentioned, a number of Assyrians, alongside Armenians, from cities such as Diyarbakir, Kharput, or Sirt, were marched out to the Syrian towns of Deir ez-Zor, Ras al-Ain, and the surrounding desert. There is no evidence that the Ottoman government provided the extensive facilities and supplies that would have been necessary to sustain the life of the hundreds of thousands of deportees during or after their forced marches. The people, therefore, themselves were forced to satisfy their hunger either by begging for food or finding it in the parched fields. The deportations were nothing but a cover for extermination. Henry Morgenthau wrote that when the Turkish authorities gave these orders for the deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. In June 1915, The German ambassador sent a cable to Berlin reporting that Talat had admitted that the deportations were not being carried out because of military considerations alone. Paul Wolf Metternich, who succeeded him, reported that a CUP representative is assigned to each of the provincial administrations in order to achieve Turkification, which means license to expel, to kill, or to destroy everything that is not Turkish. By August 1915, the New York Times reported that the roads and the Euphrates River were being strewn with corpses of exiles, and those who survived were doomed to certain death. Talat Pasha and Jamal Pasha were completely aware that by abandoning the deportees in the desert, they were condemning them to certain death. Naturally, the death rate from starvation and sickness was very high and was increased by the brutal treatment of the authorities, whose bearing towards the exiles as they were being driven back and forth over the desert was not unlike that of slave drivers. With few exceptions, no shelter of any kind was provided, and these people, coming from a cold climate, were left under the scorching desert sun without food or water. The deportations were accompanied by other heinous crimes. For example, civil populations of Assyrians were shut up in churches and burned, or forced to die from smoke inhalation and suffocation. These were the first gas chambers, and they preceded the gas chambers of Hitler. Or they were tortured to death. Assyrians and Armenians from Diyarbakir were also taken on rafts down the Tigris River, which were then capsized, drowning them. Others were taken into a gorge where they were then massacred. So here you see the river Tigris and the gorge just off the river where these people were taken and massacred. Additionally, I should mention that between 700 and 800 Armenians and Assyrians from some of the wealthiest families of Diyarbakir are said to have been killed this way. Also, boatloads of deportees sent from Deir ez-Zor down the Euphrates arrived at a town 30 miles away with 3/5 of the passengers missing. The shortest method, however, for disposing of the deportee women and children was to burn them. And one eyewitness talks of an event that happened near the Berlin to Baghdad railway, where a group of deportees were forced into a patch of burning grass, grass that was set alight by the Ottoman soldiers, and the Ottoman soldiers on horseback forced them into the fire with their guns, telling them, you have two choices, either we shoot you or you go burn yourselves. On the 13th of September 1915, the Ottoman Parliament passed the new Temporary Law of Expropriation and Confiscation, which is also known as the Law Concerning Property, Departments and Assets Left Behind by Deported Persons, also known as the Abandoned Properties Law, stating that all property, including land, livestock and homes belonging to Armenians, was to be confiscated by the authorities. Through this, the Ottoman government took possession of all abandoned Christian goods and properties, even selling them in many cases at a profit. So now I'm going to move on to the Assyrians of Hakkari. The Assyrians of the Hakkari highlands also resisted Ottoman forces and allied Kurdish tribesmen. They were not going to be an easy group to deport, as they had always been armed and were just as ferocious as their Kurdish neighbours. On the 12th of April 1915, an assembly of Assyrian tribal leaders, under the leadership of their patriarch, Mar Binyamin Shamun, decided to enter an understanding with the Triple Entente, and Russia in particular, owing to the needless attacks on Assyrian villages and the oppressive environment that their inhabitants continued to live in. On the 23rd of June 1915, the Ottoman governor of Mosul, Haydar Pasha, advanced his forces along with the Kurdish irregulars and attacked the southernmost of the Assyrian Hakkari tribes. At the same time, Jevdet Bey, the new governor of Van, did the same from the north, closing the Assyrians in and forcing them further into the mountains. When armed in insufficient numbers, these Assyrians were able to defend themselves successfully. However, they were often cut off in small pockets, vastly outnumbered and surrounded, and unarmed villagers made easy targets for Ottoman and Kurdish forces. They were finally defeated with the fall of the Tkhuma district on the 15th of September, and the surviving refugees flooded across the border into Persia. Here you can see a picture of some of the refugees from the districts of Tiare and Tkhuma who had fled into Urmia. There, the Assyrians armed themselves under the command of General Agha Petros, who had been approached by the Allies to help fight the Ottomans. Again, another composite photograph in which you can see images of Assyrians as they were refugees in Iran between 1915 and 1918. And in this corner here, you can see General Agha Petros. And this is him again, and you have Mar Binyam and Shimon on the other side. Now, the Assyrians in Urmia, who were basically cornered in Urmia, were greatly affected by the withdrawal of Russia from the war in 1917 after the revolution, and the collapse of Armenian armed resistance in the region, which left them cut off, with no supplies, vastly outnumbered and surrounded. It was the assassination of Mar Binyam and Shimon on the 3rd of March 1918 by the Kurdish chieftain Simko that eventually led, on the 3rd of July, about 4 months later, to the epic exodus of 90,000 Assyrians and Armenians, traveling some 800 kilometers over 6 weeks in helter-skelter panic, with their families, their livestock, and their possessions. They were decimated by unremitting attacks from all flanks by Turks, Kurds, and Persians, and none of those captured were spared. Here you see a couple of photographs of the refugees, which are kept at the Australian War Memorial Archive in Canberra. Persian commander Majd as-Sultaneh, on 2 occasions, cut off the retreat of these refugees and telegraphed that he had that day sent 2,000 infidels to hell. Scorched by the heat of summer and ravaged by typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and cholera, children and elderly alike, fully spent by fatigue and fever, were abandoned along the route, the dead and dying dotting the path of their flight. It is estimated that the Assyrians alone lost over 25,000 people on this march, and fewer than 50,000 survivors, Assyrians and Armenians, reached the Baqouba refugee camp in British-administrated Mesopotamia, now Iraq. So there you get an idea of the state of some of the refugees that arrived in the Baqouba refugee camp. Now, as many as 17,000 Assyrians remained stranded at Urmia when it was reoccupied by Ottoman forces, unable to flee in time. Most found refuge in mission compounds, with over 6,000 crowding the French Catholic mission and thousands more in the American mission compound, while others hid themselves in the homes of friendly Muslims and Jewish families, both in the city as well as in some villages. After the mass wave of killings in the first week of August had subsided, it was found that roughly 1,100 Assyrians managed to escape being murdered. 1,100 out of 17,000. Among those were 60 who had survived the massacre at the French mission, 60 from 6,000, and 800 that had remained at the American mission. Many of these were later killed and dispersed. The invaders granted 3 days and nights for the local Muslim populace to take their revenge on the Christians, and this extended to the confiscation of their wealth and property, as well as the further massacre of civilians. Around the second week of August, the Ottoman military ordered 500 Christian prisoners to be deported to Salamas and Van. Now we need to understand that these 500 people were not Ottoman citizens, but Persian citizens, and the Ottoman Empire was illegally deporting them. In early June of 1919, so the next year, only 184 Christians were recorded in Salamas, only 3 of whom were adult males. Thus, the majority of the deportees had perished along the way, and most of them were probably men. Another 600 Christians were evacuated from Urmia by the American consul on 15th of June 1919 for their own safety. Those Assyrians that remained in their villages when the Ottomans invaded are presumed to have all perished. So, from 17,000 Assyrians that were left behind when the 90,000 refugees fled south, only maybe 800 survived. Just to go into the aftermath, now, the First World War formally ended with the armistice signed on the 11th of November 1918. The Ottoman Empire had surrendered to the Allies 12 days earlier. The end of the Great War, however, did not mean the end of the genocide. The policy of extermination was continued by the heirs of the Ottoman Empire between 1919 and 1923, during the Turkish War of Independence, as well as between 1924 and 1925, after the formal establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey. Article 142 of the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, prepared after the war, called the Ottoman regime terrorist, and contained provisions to repair as far as possible the wrongs inflicted on individuals in the course of the massacres perpetrated in Turkey during the war. It also provided for the full protection of Assyro-Chaldeans within a Kurdish state to be determined by a referendum. This treaty, however, was never ratified by the Turkish government, which was ultimately replaced by that of Lausanne in 1923, which finally brought peace to the region. This was accompanied by a declaration of amnesty, without containing any provision in respect to the punishment of war crimes. It also did not include the Assyrians as an official minority, and as a result, the Turkish state has since ignored their rights in the country. On the 25th of February 1924, some 700 Assyrian families from Urfa, or Edessa, and Siverek were expelled to Aleppo in Syria, on the condition that they would never return, which was negotiated by their community leaders in return for their lives. Finally, in September of that same year, the Turkish military attacked and drove out the last Assyrians of Hakkari, and in September of the following year, 1925, it conducted massacres and deportations of those Chaldean Catholic Assyrians who lived in villages along the newly established border zone dividing Iraq and Turkey. Today, there are less than 25,000 Assyrians remaining within the Republic of Turkey, with no official status as an ethnic minority, and often caught in the crossfire of the conflict between the government and Kurdish rebels. As the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey denies the word genocide as an accurate term for the mass killings of more than 3 million Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks, which began to be perpetrated under Ottoman rule. Kurdish political leaders, such as jailed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan and Selahattin Demirtas of the HDP, however, openly recognize the genocide of both Assyrians and Armenians, as well as the role of the Kurds in the extermination process. So, in closing, let us return to the United Nations definition of what constitutes genocide. Firstly, killing members of the group. The Ottoman and Turkish authorities repeatedly organized the deportation and mass murder of Assyrian men, women, and children in the 20th century, with the express aim of eliminating them as a cohesive group, not simply forcing them out of the territory of the Ottoman Empire or the Republic of Turkey, but to wipe them out completely. Secondly, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. The Assyrians have endured the terrorism of the Ottoman and Turkish governments. Whether someone is shot to death by a Turkish soldier or is left by an Ottoman guard to die of starvation in the desert is irrelevant. The intent to exterminate the victim group remains. Murders of Assyrians in Turkey continue to go on unsolved. Churches are seized by the state and converted into mosques, museums, or animal pens. Teaching the Assyrian language, until recently, was effectively forbidden in the land where it had thrived for millennia. The official administrative and psychological pressure to become a Turk has forced Assyrians, the indigenous Assyrians, to immigrate to lands where they can freely be themselves, because they can't freely be themselves in their own homeland. Next, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. What is the difference between being shot, stabbed, burnt alive in your home, slaughtered in your fields, or being made to walk to death? Whether the state leaves deportees to die in the desert or in the mountains, or orders its soldiers to shoot to kill, the result and the responsibility for the ensuing deaths remains the same. Next, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Deportation, endless forced marches, hunger, thirst, exposure, and disease brought on by various Ottoman and Turkish regimes deliberately left little room for pregnancy and birth to replace those who were lost. This is not to say that Assyrian refugees did not have babies. They did. Bringing forth life in the face of such death is the ultimate act of resistance. And finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This has been a practice of the Turks in Asia Minor since the Middle Ages. We will probably never know just how many Christian boys and girls were kidnapped, forcibly converted to Islam, and raised as Turks or Kurds. And this continued throughout the genocide and even in the aftermath. Here are the photographs of people from Hakkari that I've met in my recent travels. The father of these two brothers and their sister, these three here, their father was an Assyrian from the village of Gundiktha in Tkhuma. And the father of this man here and this man in the background was an Assyrian from Nudas. And obviously, when they see other Assyrians, even though they're half Kurdish, when they see other Assyrians, they're very happy. And many of them are trying to find their relatives. So back to the definition, which I mentioned in the conclusion. The United Nations Convention states that any of these acts committed with the intent to destroy a certain group in whole or in part constitute genocide. The Assyrians have not only suffered one, but all of these acts. Indeed, the Assyrian genocide continues to this day. The question that now presents itself, however, is whether or not the Assyrians, or Christianity for that matter, have a future in the Middle East in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you very much. Indeed, the Assyrian genocide continues to this day. The question that now presents itself, however, is whether or not the Assyrians, or Christianity for that matter, have a future in the Middle East in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.